Welcome to Annunciation Radio's Faith with Reasons, the program that examines what the church teaches and why. Faith with Reasons. Well, welcome aboard. Thank you for joining us on this Wednesday, show number 451 today. And to mark the milestone, Professor Pete is in studio.
Yeah.
That's right. Dr. Peter Sibilio will be talking Bible, you might imagine. He is the Bible teacher at Lourdes University. And hopefully, if you're listening to this live, you obviously know that it's pretty smoky out there.
It is.
And hazy and thick, and I think they've got that advisory up till like midnight tonight for poor air quality. If you're listening on Saturday for the encore, well, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we're a lot better by then.
Yeah.
Can't predict.
Hopefully that's the case.
Let's hope so. And we were talking just before we went on the air. Both of these guys have taken a trip to Seattle just recently.
Yep, just recently.
And my sister lives in Seattle and has for years. I've never been the visitor. I've never been to Seattle. But a little expensive there?
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Gas was like gold, I think. Yeah. So we complain here in Toledo, but there, I don't know. I mean, they must get paid a fortune or something, because I see people in Teslas and well, that would explain why I see so many people in Teslas.
It's a little more economical there.
Well, I'm glad you're both in Toledo and in the studio at this particular moment in time.
The air was great in Seattle, I will say. I noticed a difference with the haze here. Breathe at your own risk here. It's like,
yeah, exactly.
You know, speaking of this haze, though, this is round 2 for us locally, and as you mentioned before we went on air, Ron, you know, this is not nearly. I mean, this is the first time was not nearly as bad as this. It's you can smell it.
Yeah.
And then just driving over here to the studio, you know, just driving on the road, things appeared as what you would see from newscasts, you know, of New York and that thick haze, that weird color.
Yeah.
It's you know, you want to think it's fog, but it's not. It's got this brown, creamy tint to it, and everything looks like this. You know, there's no blue in the sky. It's very strange.
Kind of looks like 70s camera shots of Los Angeles.
Yeah, exactly.
Before the EPA stepped in and helped out.
Oh, yeah.
So don't worry about breathing difficulties with your cold. You're not missing much.
That's good. Glad to hear that. Looking forward to an exciting conversation today. We're going to narrow our conversation to about 3 different topics. But there's a lot to cover.
Oh, there is.
A lot of this, these readings from Tobit that we had recently kind of brought up how interesting that Book of Tobit is.
Yeah.
Well,
and it's known as let's see, what do they call that? They call it like a novella?
Yes, exactly. As a matter of fact, that was in my notes. It got the notes right here. I don't know if I can even.
Yeah, it's a biblical novella.
Yes, huh. It's a short moral story, and if it were ever the case that Disney ever really cared about family movies again, I swear they would make Tobit into a movie. It's just a great plot.
It really is.
A lot of foreshadowing, a lot of things come together in just a wonderful way. And it brings together so much of what is both before and after it in the Bible.
Now, so Tobit, tell us about who Tobit was. I know he was wealthy.
Yes, and then he wasn't.
And then so many Bible stories on the display for us. But he was an Israelite.
Yes, he was an Israelite from the tribe of Naphtali, and even before Israel in the north is destroyed by the Assyrians, he's already living in Assyrian territory. So I know we mentioned biblical places and we get all nervous and stuff like that. We have to kind of keep the enchanted city of Nineveh in mind, which would be modern-day Iraq, and then to the east of it, the very western part of modern-day Iran, because we're going to hear about Media and 2 cities in Media. And our journey is really going to involve things that are going on in Nineveh and meanwhile in Media, right? Because Tobit, along with a number of Jews who are living in Assyria, feel very persecuted. And so he says, I could be wiped out by this Assyrian government at any moment. I better take my family money and deposit it in a city called Rages in Medea. But I'm still going to be a pious Israelite and perform all of the almsgiving works of mercy of my people, including burying the dead. And Sennacherib, he says, kind of took that privilege away from us. He says, if it's an Israelite, just throw him outside the city when he's dead. And Tobit says, I would get up in the middle of dinner just to bury my kinsmen, give them a proper burial. And he got in trouble for it.
I was going to say, he kind of did that. Yeah.
He did. Yeah. He got in trouble for it. And he said, I even got up in the middle of a sacred meal to do this one time. And what meal is it? But the Pentecost, because that's a Jewish festival before it becomes a Christian festival. And after he buries a dead kinsman, he's like, it's a hot night in Nineveh, and I'm really sweaty and tired from that. I'm just going to sleep outside. And, of course, the birds poop in his eyes, and he goes blind.
Oh, yeah.
And he's already getting up there in years, and he's going to be blind for 10 more years because of this. And so he actually prays for death. But he doesn't want to leave his family destitute, so he tells his son Tobiah, I've got money off in Rages.
I got a stash.
I want you to journey off to Rages to get that money. And that's when the Jewish mother, his wife Anna, Tobit's wife Anna, says, don't do that to my boy. Who cares about money? You and your good deeds and your money, and you're going to cost my son his life. And so Tobit says, well, we'll look for someone to guide him, someone who can go there with him, someone who can watch out for him. And wouldn't you know, a kinsman named Azariah, whose name means Yahweh is my help, shows up and says, I'll take him. And what we don't know is at the same time, in a city in Medea, near Rages, another family offered up a prayer for death. Sarah, a young girl who has gone through 7 husbands because a demon keeps killing them right on their honeymoon night, is so sad. She prays for death. And these 2 prayers of these wonderful Israelites waft up to the court of God, almost like that scene from A Wonderful Life.
Yeah.
And God dispatches Raphael, and Raphael is really Azariah in disguise. And that's just where our journey begins.
Oh, wow. So this book, is it fiction? Is it partly fiction? Do we know? I mean, we know that Job is.
Yeah, we have never found the bones of Tobit. But it's one of those stories that is absolutely conceptually true, and you can tell that it's set in the time of Assyria, but probably not finished in print until the Greek era, because there's that continuous desire to say we don't really live in a surrounding culture that's hospitable to us. And so we look for stories and heroes from our past who illustrate how to live Torah, how to be true to the prophets, how to live out our wisdom tradition in a culture that is not friendly. And boy, doesn't that help us sometimes today.
So there might have been some true characters here. There might have been some parts of the story that were true, and then there might have been some things that were I don't know, embellished.
Sure, because it's meant to sort of reflect, right, all of the application of all these centuries of Jewish wisdom to a time when it's getting harder and harder to be authentically Jewish. And so I think that's where we situate Tobit in this world of novella, in this world of historical circumstances, but more of an illustrative character.
Okay, very good.
Tobit is an adventure read.
It really is.
I mean, every book of the Bible you can pull so much from, but when you go through Tobit, it seems so different. But it also, like you say, it could easily be made into like a movie or a series.
Oh, absolutely. I think, because we just start our journey, and sure enough, I mean, and there's a lot of funny parts too.
Yeah.
Because Azariah says, hey, you have a distant relation, but we should stop off at his house because you could actually marry the guy's daughter because, distant relation though he is, all the people in line before you to marry his daughter are dead, so let's stop there.
And he says, sign me up.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Azariah has already helped him because we're told, kind of like Jonah, a great fish has attacked Tobiah. And Azariah said, well, drag him to shore, and it's actually a good thing. We'll salt some for the journey. We'll eat some tonight, but make sure you save the gallbladder, because I hear it's a good cure for blindness. And also save the heart and the liver, because that's great for different medicinal purposes. And sure enough, when they get to Ecbatana, just outside of Rages in Medea, and they meet Sarah and her parents, Raguel and Edna, right? They propose marriage. They have a wonderful celebration. And Sarah's parents are out digging the grave because they're like, we know how this is going to go. Let's bury him tonight so the whole town doesn't laugh at us, 0 for 8 here.
Yeah, right.
But Azariah says, now a little hint, remember that those fish parts, the heart and the liver, don't use perfume tonight in the bridal chamber. Burn the fish parts. And at first Tobias got to be thinking, that's not what I was planning on smelling.
Yeah, this is like
tonight.
a very good experience.
This stuff up.
But it just so happens that those odors, they don't just drive us off, they drive demons off. And so when the demon Asmodeus, whose name we think means the destroyer, right, is just ready to kill poor Tobiah, he smells the odor, he leaves the room, and that is when Raphael kicks his bottom parts. And so the demon is gone, and the parents, they can't believe it when everybody's alive in the morning. And they don't want him to leave, but Tobias says, my father's been suffering, I have to get back. And so they get the money, they go back, and that's when Raphael says, I have got a surprise for you folks.
Nice.
God heard your prayers. God heard Sarah's prayers. And so some critics will say, well, it's too fictional in that regard. But remember how much they suffered. It was really their perseverance through pain, right, and those innocent prayers that made it all the way up to God.
And I think that's emphasized because they were both praying for death.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, you really got to be at rock bottom to.
Yes. And we're told that Tobiah himself lives to 117 years of age and has 7 sons. And so there's more suffering on the way. Right? And so the suffering never ends. But Tobit stops at a number of places in the book and gives these lessons to Tobiah, but really to the entire Jewish community and really to us about how it's not an angel suddenly showing up to take care of all your problems, but that innocent, steadfast willingness to suffer and still trust in God.
And I like the part of the story that, it seems to continue through where he's doing things that don't have immediate results.
No, that's right.
And he's actually participating in the healing, the healing of his of this curse that's of his newfound wife. I should say both of them.
And
it's protection of them.
Save the gallbladder from the fish, and that's what Raphael uses to wipe the scales away from Tobit's own eyes.
Yeah.
And you can just picture the scene.
Yeah, exactly.
Here, Pop, I'm going to try this. Trust me.
Yeah, exactly. And so much of it is this wonderful way of, if they had movies back then, it would be a wonderful way of bringing Torah and prophets and Jewish wisdom to the storied screen. And yet so much of it foreshadows what we read in the Gospels, where the crowd will tell the blind man, Bartimaeus, take courage. So many times Azariah is saying, take courage, practically in the same words. We hear about some women in the Gospels, like the woman who gives everything she has, the woman who's afflicted with a hemorrhage, about persistence even in the face of suffering. And so it's like it looks forward to so much that Jesus does and says in the Gospels, while summarizing so much of the law and the prophets before him.
Oh, that's wonderful. Wonderful story.
And then,
and Luther liked it too,
He didn't want to ditch that.
No, but even he said, well, we're going to put it in the back of the Bible. And that's kind of where we start getting this idea of a second canon. And it's really not Tobit, but the section that Tobit is in that Luther objects to. But even he says, it's a great story that we should read. So it's required reading. It really is.
And, you read about all the tragedies in it, but, it's a fun read.
It is. It really is. Anyway. It really is. And the only parts that are a little difficult is you can tell they're aware of Torah. And so there's a lot of teaching. It's like, well, we're kind of reviewing Deuteronomy here. But when you read the names and the ancestry, right, it's kind of a review of the patriarchs in Genesis. Abraham and Sarah did not always get along. And sure enough, Tobit and his wife Anna don't always get along.
Oh, yeah.
And usually the wife wins in these situations. You wonder if that's part of the reason why Tobit is praying for that. It's like, I can't compete anymore.
Peter Sibilio, our guest on Faith with Reasons, and we're talking a bit about the Book of Tobit. 14 parts to this book. 14
chapters.
And is it, now I know the Psalms, for example, are arranged a certain way.
Yes.
Many of the books of the Bible, have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Is this laid out in any particular order?
Well, what you have a sort of standard introduction and conclusion, and then at every sort of key part, you have instruction from Tobit, and almost like Psalms right in the story, these wonderful poetic passages, either praying for death or a hymn of joy. And so you really do see Psalms in Tobit, as well as kind of the law and the prophets coming up in Tobit. But you actually, where do I find the Book of Tobit in the Bible? Well, again, if you have a Lutheran Bible, it should be there, but in the back. People forget that even Protestant Bibles would often print deuterocanonical books at the back until printing became extremely costly. And we thought, well, we'll just lop these ones off entirely because we don't want people to think that they're Bible. But you know what? Our earliest Bibles, all of them, have the Book of Tobit in them. The earliest Christian Bibles, the earliest codices, all have the Book of Tobit in them.
And that was, I'm going back to like maybe the very first versions of the King James and some of the very, very early ones where that was preserved.
Yes, that's absolutely true. The first edition of the King James Bible itself had the Book of Tobit. And Luther is, he doesn't really dislike Tobit that much, but if it's in that disputed section of books that was in a Hebrew canon that wasn't in the Greek version of the Hebrew canon, it's kind of those books that he wants to do away with. And so that's why that's kind of where Tobit becomes, there's no contest about Tobit until that time. So in our Bibles, they're part of that historical section. So they're going to be right before the wisdom literature and right after some of the earlier historical books like Ezra and Nehemiah. And that's right where you're going to find the Book of Tobit. But that's also why I recommend the Catholic Study Bible, because it has tabs. And all you have to do is look right on the side of the Bible.
So just to clarify, it is one of the 7 books.
Yes.
That's not found in a modern...
You would not find it at your local synagogue in Hebrew, but I bet that if we had it to do over again, we probably would, because when Jewish rabbis are putting together Hebrew Bible, one of their conditions is it has to come before Ezra. But we found some books in the Old Testament in the Hebrew that come after Ezra that are in the Hebrew Bible. Plus, they also say, well, it should be written in Hebrew. We only had witnesses to Tobit in the Greek of the Septuagint and in early Christian Bibles until the Dead Sea Scrolls, where we find copies of Tobit in both Aramaic and Hebrew.
Oh.
And so it actually was written either in Aramaic or Hebrew first. And so I think if we had it to do over again, I bet Tobit would be in Hebrew Bible too.
Interesting.
Wow. Yeah, very, very fascinating.
Wonderful story. I mean, if I'm Jewish, I want to read about Tobit because it tells me about being Jewish and non-Jewish circumstances. And it tells me a lot, certainly about the time that the story is set in, the Assyrian conquest moving to the Babylonian conquest, but it tells me a lot about Jewish sensibilities when we have to try and figure out how do we go Greek and still be Jewish. So I would definitely want Tobit in my Bible.
So just a real quick reference for the books that were removed from the Bible, the difference between the 66 and the 73 books, the two versions that we have, that really came down to what was considered part of the Hebrew Bible. Was that the determining factor?
Yeah, well, you have Martin Luther kind of really objecting to some passages in, say, First or Second Maccabees that the church had been using to talk about the importance of good works, the importance of purgatory, and when he sees that, well, Hebrew Bible doesn't have those books, he says, well, I have ammunition now to sort of sequester those books and not put them on par with the rest of sacred scripture. And so that's why you have a controversy about those 7 books. But at first he wanted to take books out of the New Testament too.
Sure. Yeah. James, I think.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And Melanchthon kind of talks him down from the ledge, so to speak.
Wow.
But even he talks about Tobit being useful for prayer and instruction as well.
It's interesting because a lot of people name their children after figures in the Bible, but you don't see many Tobits walking around, do you?
No, but you still get some Raphaels. Certainly I know in some European and Hispanic cultures. And it's nice to know that, well, the character he plays, Azariah, my helper is Yahweh, and the name Raphael, God heals. But always in God's time. It's 1 Peter, right, where we hear, I think, just the hardest verse in the whole Bible about a moment being as 1,000 years and 1,000 years as a moment. Because when I ask for something from God and God says, in a moment, it seems like 1,000 years while we're waiting.
So the time frame that this was written, once again, this was about...
We think the these different sort of folk tales, this character Tobit finally makes it to print. That's a bad way of putting it, of course, to print around 200 BC.
Okay.
Around 200 BC because it's already showing up at Qumran, right, 60, 70 years later.
And we know this based off of the facts, these fragments that we have. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I never got to take his really famous class on the Dead Sea Scrolls, but one of the great scholars who went into the caves, Father Joseph Fitzmyer, I did get to take a class or two with him, and one of his contributions was to go into the caves, look at what we would think are dried leaves that a bird might have pooped on or something, and say, no, these are actually fragments of the Book of Tobit in Aramaic, and here's what the missing parts should say, and I'm going to write up a whole dictionary about the vocabulary of this text.
Wow.
And so that was just a wonderful contribution. Very, so specialized, but just how do you put that together?
Well, that paints a great picture because you're looking at scraps of things that look like dried leaves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, this is ancient Aramaic. This is the earliest. This is going to be the earliest known fragmentary copy of the Book of Tobit we have, and it shows that it was written in a Semitic language before we have the great Christian Bibles and the Septuagint.
I think it's amazing that somebody could just pick it up and identify it, be able to read this, and
and then do a dictionary for it.
Amazing, wow, and a great adventure story.
Absolutely. It's like with Tobit, you have a wonderful story, but the story is just the beginning of the story of the book. So just a great read. And again, if you're thinking practically, I'd use the table of contents in your Bible, or maybe just call it up on your phone if you don't mind reading from the screen, but it's going to be right smack in the middle of the Old Testament if you like thumbing through. Right, it's going to be just after Ezra and Nehemiah and before the wisdom books, and it's the perfect place because it summarizes the law and the prophets beforehand, and it contains so much wisdom teaching to come as well.
there's something to be said about falling asleep and having birds go on you and wake up with cataracts.
I could relate to that in Toledo.
Yeah, be careful.
The
air where you are.
Just sleeping outside, I think the air alone in Toledo could do that for me.
Yeah, for sure.
We don't need birds. Even the birds are wearing little masks now.
yeah, they are. I did see one. I think it was a robin, but I couldn't tell.
You couldn't tell, yeah. See things at a distance you can't tell.
That's right. Peter Sibilio, our guest here on Faith with Reasons, and I love to dig into a book like that. There's so many books that we could dig into. And I don't know, you mentioned Pentecost, and I don't know if this is a good time to kind of tie that together.
Pentecost comes up right in the Book of Tobit. He leaves his Pentecost meal to bury a dead kinsman, and it's when he comes back that the bird poops in his eyes, and he gets in that big fight with his wife and says, "See, all you and your good deeds. Look what happens to you now."
So how does it happen that Pentecost goes from that tradition to our tradition?
We did that. I think we've done that 3 or 4 times on Bible Basics, I think, because people just love that question. People are really surprised when they hear that the Jewish people steal our Pentecost or something. And it's no. In fact, we sort of remobilize the Jewish idea of Pentecost. It was a pilgrimage festival. It marked the wheat harvest 50 days after the Passover. And that's why it's called Pentecosia, the Feast of 50 days. And that is why there are so many Jews from all around the world who are in Jerusalem to hear the gospel proclaimed by the apostles through the Holy Spirit on the Jewish pilgrimage feast of Pentecost.
Wow.
And Pentecost is right there in the Book of Tobit too.
Wow.
So let me understand this. Is it because of this 50-day period that somebody had the light bulb and said, "Hey, this sounds very much like Pentecost," or this actually took place at this time?
The Greek way of saying 50 days comes out in English to Pentecosia, the feast 50 days after the barley harvest and the Passover.
So how close in time were they as far as when the Jewish folks used to celebrate this compared to the upper room?
Well, that would be the same. They would celebrate it on the same day, unless they were sort of following an Essene calendar. The Essene calendar was a solar calendar, and holidays were a few days before. That's one of the explanations that some scholars have given for, say, a difference in the Passover between Gospel of John and the Synoptic Gospels, is maybe John is kind of following an Essene-style Jewish calendar, and the Passover would have already sort of happened for the Essenes, but it's still coming up for the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And
fascinating.
Yes, and 50 days later, Pentecost.
There you go.
The Feast of 50 Days.
Very cool.
And your students are lucky. I'd love to sit in on your classes. Every time you're here and every time I talk to you, I learn something.
Well, I don't know if they can say that, but so you'd be more than welcome.
Very good.
Pardon me. Popping with a cold. We'll be right back.
Traveling? Take us with you. The Annunciation Radio mobile app keeps you connected everywhere you go. Share pictures, prayer requests, testimonials, and comments, and listen live anytime. The Annunciation Radio app is a great travel companion.
Experience the incredible story of a woman who Time magazine named the most influential Catholic woman in the United States. Rita Rizzo, the future Mother Angelica, grew up in a working-class neighborhood in Canton, Ohio during the Great Depression. Rita's father abandoned the family before she was 5 years old. Her early years of trial were compounded by a debilitating illness until she was healed by Jesus through a woman named Rhoda Wise. That healing set her life on a course that would ultimately change the world. Learn the amazing story of Rita Rizzo at the Mother Angelica Museum in her hometown of Canton, Ohio. Go to www.motherangelicamuseum.com. Be inspired. Plan your visit now at motherangelicamuseum.com.
Do you have something you'd like to ask our bishop? Most Reverend Daniel Lee Thomas answers questions from our listeners each and every week on the Bishop's Corner. Send in your questions about the faith, today's cultural trends, diocesan news and events, prayer life, anything on your mind. Click the Bishop's Corner tab at AnnunciationRadio.com or on our app and listen for his answer Thursdays at 4:30 p.m., Fridays at 11, and Saturdays at noon on Annunciation Radio.
A portion of our programming today here on Annunciation Radio is underwritten by Jeff Trout, State Farm Insurance of Toledo. You may reach Jeff at 419-473-3276. Thank you for underwriting on Annunciation Radio.
Now, back to Faith with Reasons here on Annunciation Radio.
Hey, welcome back here. Shayne Stanfield with Ron Finn, and today we're blessed to have Professor Pete in studio. Give him a proper bio. He's Director of MA in Theology, Assistant Professor of Theological Studies at Lourdes University, and of course, you may recognize his voice. He's our host here at Annunciation Radio, the daily series Bible Basics on Annunciation Radio, and we finished the last half hour talking about. Ron mentioned how much. What we learned, and maybe we talked about this off air, but anyhow, we were discussing this idea of Pentecost, and I needed to clarify this because I was not aware that Pentecost was actually being celebrated in the Jewish community at the time. So we're really celebrating.
Yes.
We're continuing to celebrate Pentecost, but in a different way.
It's sort of remobilized for our chapter of salvation history. There were 3 festivals when especially Jewish men of age would be obliged, if possible, to make a journey to Jerusalem. One of them is the Passover, and then 50 days later, they should come back if at all possible. And so that's why you have that setting in Acts 2 where everyone is surprised. We are from Rome. We are from Medea, we are from Parthia, like we heard of in the Book of Tobit. How can we possibly be understanding these men? We don't know their dialect of Aramaic, but we hear them speaking about the Messiah, Jesus, risen from the dead, in our own languages. And so God picked the absolute perfect moment and provided the Holy Spirit at the perfect moment to take advantage of that natural crowd that was just gathering there because of their calendar.
For the Jewish Passover.
For 50 days after the Jewish Passover.
Pentecost, Jewish Pentecost.
To get things going on God's calendar.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. Well, I've just learned something.
See, there you go.
And, because it is Wednesday, right, we have to say that the apostles drove a Toyota there because they were all in one accord.
Oh, boy.
Part 2, ladies and gentlemen.
Continues.
I love it.
Very, very
that
good.
Was better than any of the ones we told this morning.
Yeah.
I've already been stealing like my quizzes are so easy they should be in a coloring book, but to connect the dots is where I draw the line. Yeah, I'm already, and they're not laughing. I'm like that thing about a pigment of that's funny.
Yeah,
came to me out of the blue. That's funny. What?
We like to take advantage of the poor air quality when people's senses are dulled.
Yeah, there you go.
To get those jokes across.
You can blame it on a lack of oxygen.
Right. The haze may be brain affecting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, our air quality on Annunciation Radio is still top notch.
Yes,
I like that. Very good. Very good. I should mention too that you have a new feature that's heard on Annunciation Radio during the Faith Alive program.
Yes.
With Rodney Schuster for All About Catholic Charities. You're doing a 5-minute feature called Social Justice in the Bible.
Yes.
Which is very fascinating.
It is a wonderful topic because you look for the phrase social justice and you don't find it. You find justice all over the place, but it's really a Catholic seminary teacher who says, you know what, we have to add the phrase social, not because we're changing anything in the Bible, but because 1,800 years after Jesus, we've gotten so self-centered. We've forgotten that the idea of social was just embedded in his idea of justice. And so it truly is a Catholic phrase that he teaches to the soon-to-be Pope Leo, of Rerum Novarum fame. And that is where the phrase really goes viral, to use our term, but it is a Catholic phrase right from the Bible, not word for word, but teasing out what's always been there, that we in our sort of Western hyper self-focused view of things forgot.
And we should mention, though, that this term has been hijacked. It's been corrupted. It's
many things have. Right?
Yeah.
God is love, and love comes in the flesh in Christ, who shows us what love is. But now I'm told, love anyone you want. I don't think they mean the same thing.
or love is love, and that's not referring to. Yeah,
no, and and what should we have? Pride. All these commercials, pride is universal. Well, how come they only show one sort of thing to be proud in? Right. When are we going to see a nice family going to church and being proud of that in one of the commercials?
Yeah.
If it's universal, could we see that example of it, please? I don't think we're going to, and we only have a few days left, so I could be wrong.
And then the month will be over. But somehow I think it'll continue. And this will be more of a season. So
something,
It's just something.
Now, tomorrow, the 29th, is a solemnity of Peter and Paul.
It is not one of the 12 great feasts, but we sometimes think, well, Pentecost, there's no feast until, we get into the Christmas season again. But that's not true. It is considered a great feast in both East and West, Peter and Paul together. And, of course, today, Irenaeus.
Yeah.
So we think that the first celebrations of Peter and Paul together on one feast day date to just after Irenaeus' life, and already by 395, Augustine is mentioning this day specifically as the feast of Peter and Paul together. So it's a very ancient feast, and we celebrate it tomorrow. I study Paul. I'm named after Peter. And I always loved this day, speaking of being selfish, when I was a kid, because I think I was baptized on the feast of St. Peter and Paul.
Wow.
And so my Italian relatives would give me money. And now they're with the Lord, and so I don't get any money anymore.
Well, I'll get you a Mounds bar.
Okay.
That's Peter and Paul, isn't it?
That's true.
Absolutely.
That's right. Of course,
these two men, obviously.
I suppose I feel like a nut.
Sometimes you don't. But these two, you can't really come up with more two divergent personalities than these two.
It just shows you what wonderful things God does through all different sorts of people. Because, Paul will even say, I dared to disagree with Peter face to face. We just had this meeting in Jerusalem. We go up the road to modern day Syria and Antioch, and I don't think he's going far enough with it. And it's interesting in Paul's letters. In his letters, he never mentions going back to Antioch again. Acts does, but he doesn't. And so he'll say, I was even willing to say we have to go even farther with really making the Gentiles our brothers and sisters. And you think, well, Peter was, a Galilean, Aramaic speaker, kind of we think a small businessman, not rich, but not destitute. And Paul was an educated Pharisee or student of a Pharisee, probably from wealthy parents, but from all the way up in Turkey, not by geography, but only by lineage, an Israelite. And certainly the beneficiary of a much better and more formal education than Peter. And so both turned out to be kind of great draft picks. But only God could see that, because, of course, Paul starts out persecuting the church, and Peter gets a lot of things wrong, but both were very, very passionate. And it seems like God says, that's what I want, and we're going to make it work.
So what do we know about Paul's early life, or do we? I mean, if he's originally from Turkey, how did he end up, in the Jerusalem area at this time?
We kind of have to, we got to Well, in school, we call it hypothesis. In other words, we guess.
Yeah.
We kind of sort of feel our way around.
And let's just clarify this. These are educated guesses.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes. Yes. Which just means they're made by educated people, which is a euphemism for boring.
Not in your case.
Well, it's much still, like you mentioned, you might recognize this. It's much better to recognize my voice than my face. So
today's topic of humility, we'll revisit it another time.
But we say, well, Paul talks about being from Tarsus himself. And so what do we know about the city of Tarsus? And Paul is a Benjaminite, but he talks about his Judaism. So in that sense, he is definitely Jewish, and he's very proud of his Judaism. He boasts of it, and he says how I advanced in it. What could we say about Jews from Tarsus? And Paul can write. We have his letters. Most Jews, most people couldn't. So what can we sort of infer about his educational background? Mm-hmm. And then he says, but I was also sent to Jerusalem to study at the foot of a famous Pharisee, Gamaliel. Mm-hmm. So his parents must have had some means, and he knows a trade, right? He's a leather worker, mm-hmm. and leather was everywhere in the Roman Empire. In fact, can you guess what the number one purpose of cowhide in the Roman Empire was? To keep the cow in one piece. But after that, it was leather. And so you get the feeling that his father, he says, I'm a Pharisee from Pharisees. So mm-hmm. his father had that educational background, but owned his own business. Paul was the owner's son, so he picked up the trade, but he didn't have to work with his hands, and was able to get a good education. Tarsus, known for its education, its rhetoric, but then we would say probably mid-teens had the money to be sent to Jerusalem to study under Gamaliel, and then seems to be a synagogue leader, or at least known to the synagogue's halfway home in Antioch, and does not want this crazy idea, this double falsehood of this person he never met, Jesus, crucified by the Romans, condemned by the Sanhedrin itself. We can't have fellow Jewish people saying he's the one who begins the era of resurrection from the dead, and this is not what Messiah is supposed to do. And so we're taking these two falsehoods as a reason to let people who aren't Jewish into my beloved Judaism. No way. I'm going to stop this. And then Jesus showed up.
And that's where everybody had this preconceived notion that Christ was this mighty warrior that was going to conquer Rome and, and take back remove the oppression, take back land and whatnot. And
whatever sort of conception you had of Messiah, Paul will say, it wasn't going to be this. And I myself was in that crowd. But that's why you say, look, kind of like my big fat Greek wedding, two groups of people, Greeks and everybody who should be so lucky. Paul has that kind of idea, right? There are Jews and then everybody else who should be so lucky. If you're in the everybody else should be so lucky, this is nonsense. Mm-hmm. If you're Jews, this is a stumbling block that you can't get over. But to those Jews and non-Jews alike, it is the very power of God for our salvation.
Wow. So that's...
and he said, I lived it.
Yeah. Which, it probably made him such a great evangelist because, one, he was well known.
Yes.
He had this lineage, obviously very, very well educated, helped him be able to obviously explain probably better than most the relation of actual Christ being illuminated in the Old Testament.
Yes.
And confirming, look, I finally met him on the road to Damascus.
He'll usually start out by saying, whatever your misunderstanding is, I can relate to it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And he'll often start out with words of praise. Okay, here's something you're doing right. Right? And yes, I am so thankful for these gifts that God has given you. Mm-hmm. And then he'll tick off certain gifts. And then throughout his letter, he'll say, well, here's how you're getting those gifts wrong. Mm-hmm. And so he'll kind of start out with praise and say, let's take a look at this wonderful thing you're doing. And here's what I'm going to say you're doing right, but here's what needs to be better. Here's what you're not understanding. And he can say that about so many different issues. Poor guy, I mean, he can look at Jewish Christians who don't like him because they'll say all of a sudden he's not Jewish enough. And then he can talk to people who've never even heard of Moses.
Yeah.
And say, why is this guy being so Jewish? What's with this guy? We're not interested. We're not going to be Jewish. What's he talking about? And so he has to deal with so many misunderstandings, both from a Jewish and from a non-Jewish perspective. It's almost like he's the only person who could have done it.
Yeah. Well, what came to mind when you said earlier, he has this very unique way of praise. What came to mind was where he was, and I forget where, but he'd gone through and he found all of these different altars.
Yes.
And he picks the altar of the unknown
Acts
God.
18.
And he uses this altar and say, well, let me tell you about who this unknown God is, because he knew all the other ones were identified.
Yes.
He knew who they were and what they did, but there's one that's unidentified, and he uses that.
And it was often, especially among educated Jews, to sort of make fun of in a very, very negative way. Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 12, for instance, make fun of these Gentiles for all of their ridiculous, crazy gods and how blind they are because of it. Well, Paul almost does it in a positive way by saying, I love
your faithfulness, your
You
religions.
are so focused on this idea of God, and that one altar. I think you're crazy, superstitious, nervous people here, But let me turn it around and say that unknown God, you are so right to have an altar to the unknown God. I'm going to make him known to you.
Yeah, yeah, beautiful. Yeah, and that's just such a great talent of his.
Yep. Yep, exactly.
And he would enter a town, set up like a church, set up shop there, basically. Yes. Teach the people, and then he would move on, and they would love to. He was beloved. They loved him. They were sorry to see him go, hoping that he would return again soon. So he really had that kind of effect on people. Once they hear the good news from him, this super Pharisee turned a terrific evangelist, it turns them around, and they revere him even more.
Absolutely. And that's the one thing. Paul did not seem to leave people neutral outside the church, but even inside the church. His letters talk about how he has some people who will quite literally walk to the ends of the earth with him. And then there are other people, like, he's violently treated by someone in the church at Corinth, shamefully treated. And there are some folks who don't like him at all, like what you're saying. Whether it's Jewish or Gentile, makes a lot of claims on my life. And what do you mean I have to look at my slave as my brother? Are you kidding me? Who are you to tell me all this?
Yeah.
And if I want to give you money, then you should take money. And, of course, that means that, you kind of owe me one. You're not playing by the rules, Paul. And so he'll usually go to a town, because that was how you got news. There was no Yahoo or cell phones. You had platforms for speakers, and town criers would run from one town to the other and either say, bad news, the barbarians are coming, or good news, there is peace and the civil war is over. And so Paul would do a number of things. He'd always seem to go to the synagogue and talk about Messiah in the scriptures and say, this Messiah has come and is risen from the dead, and that's my Pharisaic belief in bodily resurrection of the dead, now available to you in Jesus Messiah. But at the same time, he often had friends like Prisca and Aquila who had a leather working shop. And so he would get work there and talk, obviously, about Jesus to any curious customer. And at the same time, go to these speakers' platforms and say, good news. Christ is risen. Christos anesti. Right, one of the earliest proclamations of the church, Paul would say, on the speaker's platform, right in downtown Corinth, good news, Christ is risen. And then they say, who is this Christos? What do you mean? And that he jumped up, what do you mean? And then Paul says, well, let me tell you.
Yeah. I would probably equate his conversion and the impact on what that meant to people in his day, those that knew him or knew of him, to witness this transformation in Paul is probably very much like today, seeing maybe a well-known atheist, proclaim, I'm now a believer.
And
or even somebody, a very famous Protestant preacher, and they say,
Richard Newhouse, for instance,
I'm going to become Catholic.
Yeah, Richard Newhouse, right? A famous Protestant minister becomes Catholic and a great scholar and voice for the church. But there's a wonderful book. I heard about it. And of course, I'm going to get in these traffic accidents. One, because I'm a terrible driver, and two, because I hear so much on this station. We just had someone on, I think it was on a national show where it might have been Al Cresta, where he does history from the perspective of people in the church, specifically, who made history.
Oh.
And one of the things he'll say is, imagine if there weren't a St. Paul, right? Is there anyone after Jesus who has had more of an impact, say, on the Western world than Paul? And maybe you could say Peter, but the two would be together again.
Oh yeah. No, that's remarkable.
He says, let's just go through, instead of chapter on the 100s, chapter on the 200s. Let's go through this from the perspective of the saints of the time and what they do. And boy, what a great way to do history of the world.
Oh yeah,
and especially history of the West.
Based on people that have made significant change on their conversion or their
And so let me tell you about this person, Peter. Let me tell you about this person, Paul. And boy, are you going to learn a lot about the Greco-Roman world, about different flavors of Judaism, about the entire Mediterranean basin in the process.
Yeah. And at one point he boasts of. We just read that recently, but he goes back and he just goes down the list of
how many hijackings, how many
how many times he's shipwrecked, left for dead, stoned.
2 Corinthians 12 and 11 and 12, and it shows us that through it all there are these crashing waters of chaos, but a sense of purpose so deep that Paul can call God the God of love and peace. And so despite all that happens, real dangers, real stresses, he says, I'm under stress for the churches behind who want me to visit, and stresses for the churches I have yet to build. I've got this homework assignment from Jesus. I've got to get everybody involved before he comes back. And I know I don't have a date, but the work I have to do is so great that it makes it like a thief in the night. But despite all of those pressures, he admits he feels he's still the God of love and peace who gives him purpose. It shows us, though, that we sometimes have this crazy notion that when God shows up, it's with a winning lottery ticket. No, life doesn't get easier; it gets more meaningful.
Yeah, if you're not oppressed, challenged, persecuted, you're not doing something properly.
That's right.
Well, one makes you wonder, getting back to that reading, as he goes down that litany of all of those things terrible things that had happened to him, and he's continuing with such joy. That we find him with Silas chained and they call it prison, but back then the reality of that prison was, from what I understood, was a big hole dug into the, and it was just a nasty.
Prisons were not about rehabilitating, getting your GED. They were places of punishment where you often died.
I pictured, when it was described that way to me, I pictured it almost like a well, know, and they're chained to a stake at the bottom of this thing, and what are they doing? They're singing all night long.
Yes,
singing praise.
Exactly. And you find that in Acts too. They felt pain as much as we did. They felt disappointment and pressures just as much as we did. But sometimes, we were talking about stories. I'll ask a student sometimes, did you ever know someone who just knew why she was here, or he just knew what his purpose was? And I'll start getting some nods, and I'll say, was that person the youngest? No. Was that person the prettiest? No. Was that person the richest? No. Did that person just have a sense of happiness that lasted even through the worst of times? Yes. And it's because of that sense of purpose. And Paul and Peter both say, what a ground floor opportunity.
Yeah.
The whole point of human history. I can get in on the ground floor of it right now. And so that's the only thing that outlasts the bad days.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And no matter what the days bring, we know where we're going and we know what we're about.
Mm-hmm. That's that sense of purpose.
Yep.
Wonderful.
Yep.
Yep, the familiar voice of Professor Pete. Yeah, Peter Sibilio in studio with us. Always a pleasure to have you in studio. I listen to you every day, but I don't get to see your face every couple of months.
For my students, it's just the opposite. They see my face every day, but I don't think they listen.
I told them before the show, though, on a fairly regular basis, we just live down the street from Lourdes. So I told him I see him fairly regularly, and he's always out jogging.
Well, I thank you for calling it jogging. That is a euphemism. And thank you for not mentioning the bill collector.
Didn't notice that you were being chased.
Yeah.
So if you see a stalker peeking through your classroom window,
that's true.
Likely Shayne.
Yeah.
Well, I have to think, what are we going to do in the fall? I'm going to hopefully maybe talk with some folks in the diocese about it. Right now we're coming up kind of the end of the cycle. Every few years I'll say, anybody who wants to learn Greek, just come to Lourdes and we'll just start from the beginning, learn New Testament Greek. No charge. We'll pick a night and we'll just get a room here. And I had 4 students and I'm kind of down to 2 students, but we're kind of, we've already done the grammar. We've read some of Acts, and maybe we'll just start over and say, hey, let's get some more folks. It's free. Just come to Lourdes, pick a night. Wow. Here are the books.
Yeah.
Let's do some New Testament Greek.
Pretty neat.
I think so. I think it keeps me reading. So I gotta say, for all the different classes I teach, it's the New Testament Greek where I have to prepare the most. I'm like, how's that word supposed to be accented again? Which way does the little squiggle go? I gotta check this myself.
So you go in and you're actually learning a language.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's fascinating.
Yep. And we do a little bit of modern Greek. I haven't used my modern Greek since Chicago, so I'm practically, mute when it comes to that. But, we'll take a look at differences in pronunciation, and for fun, we'll see, well, hey, they posted Little Mermaid. How much of the words? And they usually print the Greek below it. And I'm like, can you recognize? See, isn't this fun? Disney and 2,000 years ago. What a tradition.
Really.
Right?
I'm going to have to sign up for that because the only time I speak Greek is when I order a euro. Now, how about the master's course? Do you have another cohort for me?
No, but we're gonna see we have a new president. And so with that, it's always something like, I'll say we've got 7 great people. And I'll always hear, great, make sure you get 7 more and then we'll talk. And so the key is coffee, tea, and me. Say you want to have coffee with me and tea, and we'll talk about it. Right?
Very good.
Nice.
And because that can be so useful.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Not only just for personal fulfillment and advancement, but it's applicable.
It certainly is, absolutely, especially in the church today.
Yeah. And what's the best way to get a hold of you?
I would say certainly through the station right here and through Lourdes, either by phone or the webpage.
Very good. Lourdes University.edu?
LOURDES.edu. I tried to get a hold of it. It's not LORD. It's LOURDES. That could explain it.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for coming in today.
My pleasure.
Wonderful conversation.
Always fun. Before you leave, we'll have to get our calendars together and see if we can pick the next one.
Absolutely. We didn't get to do too much Peter today.
I know. We're running out of time as usual. Thanks for joining us on Faith with Reasons. Breathe easy, everybody.